If I was to ask you what are some of the similarities and differences that you see in the aftermath of the 2010 and the 2022 floods, what would your response be?
So first of all, thank you for having me. The similarities in terms of 2010 and 2022, as I see them, are that we did have immediate responses from the international community. That's very clear. In both cases, you had large-scale responses from many countries, from countries as well as from multilateral organizations. But the big difference, and this is a very troubling difference, is that the response was much larger in 2010. I would argue that we're seeing much less of a response this time, even though there has been a significant response. We have not had as many countries, for example, responding with pledges and of assistance in this case. And I think there's several reasons for that. One, if you look at the case of the United States, back in 2010, the U.S. was in Afghanistan. It was fighting a war there. So it was very easy for it to deploy military helicopters to come in to help evacuate stranded people in 2010. Of course, the U.S. has left Afghanistan, so it's not as easy for the U.S. to mobilize with military aircraft, even though that is happening this time, but not as much. I'd also argue that there are so many other major humanitarian crises going on right now that you didn't have as much of back in 2010. The war in Ukraine has triggered a horrific humanitarian crisis. Afghanistan has a terrible humanitarian crisis. Yemen as well, and there are others. So I think donor fatigue is much more of an issue now than it was in 2010. And final point, the global economy has been experiencing major shocks now that were not there back in 2010. Pandemic-induced shocks, and also shocks induced by the war in Ukraine in terms of skyrocketing commodity costs. So this all means that the environment, unfortunately, is not as favorable for such a large-scale international response to these floods in the way that you had back in 2010. And this is problematic because these floods are so much worse than the ones in 2010, as catastrophic as the ones back then were as well.